There are 150 Pokemon you are born to see, and seeing as it is my 150th video, it is the perfect time to see can I beat the game with only Kanto Pokemon. Now in XD, you are actually given quite a few Gen 1 Pokemon. In fact, there are 50 throughout the game that you can catch, and not counting the baby forms or evolutions that came after Gen 1, there are a total of 64 Kanto Pokemon to use in this game. Now, with that being said, there is one Pokemon that I will not have access to throughout the main story of the game, and that is Dragonite, because it requires that you catch every other Shadow Pokemon in the game, which I'm not really willing to do. Anyway, with that being said, while this is a challenge video, I'm not really going to be ranking it, seeing as I treated this more as a fun run to do for the 150th video, rather than the speedrun-ish type videos that I do. Anyway, with that being said, luckily we do start with Eevee, which gives us access to all 3 evolutions, and since I've used Jolteon most recently, I decided to flip a coin between Flareon and Vaporeon, and I got Vaporeon, which is definitely going to be a nice start for the beginning of the game. And there is a bit of a problem with the Kanto Pokemon in this game, and that is the fact that you don't get access to one for a very long time. So I go ahead and speed through the first area of the game with relative ease, and then I go to the Cypher base where I run into the Power Rangers, and today I decide to fight Brown because I have super effective damage against this Baltoy. Also, I should just say, even though I am trying to catch all the Kanto Pokemon, if I end up KOing a few, or they get taken down by other circumstances, I might not actually go back for them. This is just more of a fun run. Anyway, with that being said, at level 16, Vaporeon gets the move Water Gun, and I attempt to catch the Snubbull, because it's holding the Charcoal item, which raises Fire-type damage by 10%, but after breaking out of the first ball, and then subsequently the second ball, Vaporeon actually suffers its first loss, which is a little bit unfortunate, so I go back into the battle once again, and the same thing nearly happens again, so I decide to just take down the Snubbull. It's not a Gen 1 Pokemon, so we move on. At level 23, Vaporeon gets Quick Attack, which I teach over Tackle, and while Carvanha isn't a Gen 1 Pokemon, it is holding the Black Glasses item, which will help Vaporeon in this next fight. So we now go into the battle against Lavrina. She leads with a Love Disc and a Beautifly, and I go for Bite into the Beautifly right away, hoping for a flinch or a KO. And while it isn't a KO and I don't get a flinch, it also doesn't do much damage back to me. So I'm able to finish it off the next round, and then she sends out her Roselia. Now, judging by the damage that Vaporeon was doing to the Beautifly, I know I need a flinch with Bite in order to get past this Roselia, and luckily I get it. Otherwise it would have set up Leech Seed, and because of Vaporeon's very high health, it would have been healing a huge amount. She then sends out her final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Delcatty. I go for Bite into it, actually dealing half to it, so I know I'll be able to take it down on the following turn. And that'll just leave her Love Disc, which might survive an attack, but can't really do much back to me. So one bite takes it down to low yellow, and a second bite finishes it off, and we beat Lavrina. So a very easy fight. Now moving on, and we need to talk about duking and the Pokespots. Now, while I'm not going to go in depth on this video because I recorded another one prior to this one and I'll go more in depth there, I do need to set up a few of the Pokesnacks here in order to catch a couple different Pokemon. And in our last Pokespot, we run into the obligatory Mirabee. How are you doing on this fine day, Mirabee? Well, Mirabee is actually interesting in the Kanto challenge because he has our first other Kanto Pokemon, which is Voltorb, which I'm going to, of course, catch right away, and it is also holding the Magnet item, raising Electric-type damage by 10%. So, thank you, Mirabee, but before we leave, we go ahead and set up a few Pokesnacks here, and then we move on to the ONBS building, where we run into Vulpix, which is our next Gen 1 Pokemon, and so I go for Bite just to lower its health down a little bit, and it crits, taking it down in a single hit. Now, I know I said it didn't really matter too much if I end up missing a few, but the thing is that in the early game especially, there's not a lot of Kanto Pokemon available, so I want to make sure I can catch every single one, so luckily I did save right before this fight, and so I was able to get it fairly quickly. Now moving on, and while this doesn't have anything to do with the challenge, in a previous video I mentioned how Shadow Panic doesn't affect Pokemon with soundproof, and I didn't have a recording for it. This time I do. Now moving on to Finax City, where I run into my next Pokemon, which is a Meowth, which I'm going to, of course, catch right away. While it's not the best Pokemon, it certainly is very fast, which is very helpful. Now moving on, I pick up the Swinub for the Never Melt Ice item to raise Ice type damage by 10%, and then I go ahead and purify both Voltorb and Vulpix at the same time, and then I pick up 3 more Shadow Pokemon, Spearow, Grimer, and Seal, Before moving on to the battle against Snaddle, he leads with a Lantern and a Quagsire, and right away I go for Bite into Lantern. Unfortunately, no flinch, but Vaporeon really doesn't take much damage in return. Go for Confuse Ray into the Quagsire, that way it's not going to be hitting as many Rock Tombs, hopefully. And then on the following turn, because I suspect that Quagsire is going to go after Vulpix, I decide to go ahead and dig this turn, and it'll do decent damage to the Lantern as well. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to KO though. And Quagsire does flinch from the Bite. I go for Ember into the Lantern and Bite to finish off the Quagsire, and that brings out this next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Lunatone. Vulpix is not able to finish off Lantern. I know it wasn't very effective, but I kind of expected it to do a little more. And then, since Vulpix got taken down, I send out Voltorb. I go for Spark, hoping for a Paralysis, but I don't get it. I go for Bite, hoping for a flinch, and I do get it. So now Lunatone is in range to be taken down by Voltorb. I send out Meowth, and at this point both of his Pokemon are fairly low, so I think as long as I hit the Lunatone with a Payday and then I go for Swift, I should be able to take them both down. Except that's not quite the case. Payday does take it down to a very small sliver, but unfortunately since it doesn't go down, it's able to set up Shadow Sky, and then he sends out Cast Form. Once his Lantern goes down, I go for Spark into it, no Paralysis, and Payday is finally able to finish off the Shadow Lunatone, bringing it his final Pokemon, which is a Metang. Meowth nearly gets finished off by a Weather Ball, but luckily because it is a Shadow Pokemon, it's not actually going to faint this turn to the Fruity Pebbles. I go for a Spark into the Metang, not really doing too much damage, but I do paralyze it, and go for a Shadow Rush, dealing a little bit of extra damage. Meowth goes down, I send out Spearow, and luckily Metang does get paralyzed this turn, and now I'm hoping to set up a Shadow Panic so that they can't attack nearly as often. I go for Spark, which does take Metang down pretty low. Unfortunately, Spearow does go down to a Shockwave, and so I'm forced to send out my final Pokemon, Grimer. Thunder Punch nearly takes Grimer down to half health, and after a set of Fruity Pebbles, I know I can take down Metang with a single Spark, and all that's left is that Cast Form, which does take Grimer down very low, but Shadow Blitz nearly takes it down in a single hit. Though all that's left to do is have Voltorb finish it off. I do call just to get Grimer out of reverse mode and to lower its Shadow Gauge, but with that we defeat Snaddle, and now we move on to the Cave Pokespot once again, where I finally get a Zubat, which I'm going to catch right away. Unfortunately, I'm not able to evolve it into Crobat for this challenge, so I'm not going to end up using it. But then I run into a Sandshrew right after, and I actually do kind of want to use Sandshrew. So I'll go ahead and add it to the team, and then soon after I purify Grimer. And now to one of the most important areas in the game, and that is because this person here is selling timer balls, and because every Shadow Pokemon is in a battle with an actual trainer, the battles take a lot longer, and so the timer balls are much more effective. Anyway, now moving on, at level 26 Grimer gets Screech, and at level 27 Voltorb gets Self-Destruct. I can't turn down Self-Destruct. And then I go ahead and purify Spearow, which evolves immediately into Fearow. And I didn't know this, but if you evolve a Pokemon at the Relic Stone, it actually updates the model after the purification is done, which is kind of interesting. I go ahead and purify Seal, and I'm going to actually replace Vaporeon with it, and then at level 29 Vulpix gets Flamethrower, and then I go into the battle against Gonzap. He leads with an Electrode and a Nuzleaf, and right away I go for Aerial Ace into the Nuzleaf, and Ice Beam into the Electrode, which Ice Beam does almost nothing. Another Spark takes down Fearow, I send out Sandshrew, and yeah, no, my team was not doing very well going into this. So, unsurprisingly, I go down fairly quickly. Okay, let's go back in for a second attempt, now with an actual plan in mind. Immediately, I go for Spark and Flamethrower into the Electrode, hoping that I can possibly get a Paralysis. Though, at the same time, the downside to Spark is that it is a contact move, so I could also end up getting paralyzed by its static ability. Anyway, I decide to swap out Vulpix for Sandshrew, that way it'll either go for Sonic Boom or Thief, which I already know Thief doesn't take down Sandshrew from the first attempt, and so I can slowly whittle it down. Poison Sting doesn't do much, but I was really hoping that it would just poison. Anyway, I decide to go ahead and go for Self-Destruct, considering that Voltorb is already getting very low, and I decide to send out Seal, who is probably my best answer to surviving it. And so Self-Destruct takes down the Electrode, and does quite a bit to Seal, doesn't quite take down the Nuzleaf, and so I then send out Fearow, he then sends out his Vileplume, and Nuzleaf is stuck recharging, go for Aerial Ace into Vileplume doing over half. Unfortunately, Seal does go down, though that crit definitely did not matter. I send out Vulpix once again, and luckily Vileplume does miss a Sleep Powder, and I go for another Aerial Ace to finish it off, and then I decide not to learn Pursuit. And then he sends out Whiscash. I go for Heat Wave, which doesn't do much to Whiscash, but does take down the Nuzleaf, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, a Skarmory. And I go for another Heat Wave and Aerial Ace, which Heat Wave does about a third to Skarmory, though more importantly it burnt Whiscash, so Whiscash really isn't all that much of a threat anymore. Hyper Beam takes Fearow down fairly low, Flamethrower finishes off Skarmory, and all that's left is the Whiscash, which goes for Rock Tomb, not really doing that much to Fearow, and it's taken down to low red. Flamethrower isn't quite enough to finish it off, and while it is able to take down Vulpix, I can get a little bit of extra experience on Grimer before it goes down to Aerial Ace. Now moving on, and I realized that I could have evolved Vulpix before that fight because the only thing I was waiting on was getting Flamethrower, but anyway, I evolved Vulpix into Ninetales, and one of the things about this game is that there's only 2 Firestones, and one is optional, and so I have to choose between either Vulpix or Growlithe here to evolve into Arcanine, and in the last challenge I did involving these two, I decided to take the Arcanine, so this time I decided to keep the Ninetales instead. This fight is also important though, because before the Growlithe here was a Paris, and unfortunately due to my bad planning, Heat Wave absolutely roasted the poor thing. So unfortunately we have our first lost Gen 1 Pokemon, so hopefully that doesn't end up happening too many more times. But anyway, I go ahead and capture the Growlithe here for another Pokemon, and then at level 29 Seal gets the move Rest, which I decide to teach over Safeguard, and then our Sandshrew evolves into a Sandslash, which is going to be very helpful because the Earthquake TM is coming up. At level 24, Sandslash gets the move Slash, which I teach over Scratch, and then I decide to teach Thunderbolt to Voltorb over Spark before it evolves into Electrode, which is going to be a very nice upgrade for it. And then finally at the top of the tower, I get Earthquake, which I teach to Sandslash over Sand Attack. Now we need to go back just a bit because this place may as well be the Gen 1 tower with the amount of Gen 1 Pokemon that are here. So with that, let's go ahead and get them all caught. We have Shelter, Beedrill, Pidgeotto, Tangela, Butterfree, Magneton, Venomoth, Weepinbell, and of course Arbok. Anyway, now moving on to the battle against Gorgon, he leads with a Lairon and a Celio, and right away I go for Aerial Ace into the Celio, dealing almost no damage, and Earthquake, which takes down the Lairon in a single hit, and deals a decent amount of damage to Celio. Then he sends out Slowking, and luckily Sandslash doesn't go down to a single Aurora Beam, so I'm able to go for another Aerial Ace and Earthquake combo, which doesn't quite take down the Slowking, but does finish off the Celio, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is an Ursaring. And Water Pulse takes down Sandslash, so I decide to send out Electrode. And because I'm not exactly certain at first he was going to protect because there is a flying type on the field, I decide to go ahead and attack both. Slowking does go down to Aerial Ace, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Primeape, which is another Gen 1 Pokemon. Ursaring doesn't even go down to half with Thunderbolt. Aerial Ace gets Primeape down below half. Slash gets a crit, finishing off Fearow in a single hit. Then I send out Ninetales, and I go for another Thunderbolt into the Ursaring, and then I go for Heat Wave to hopefully take it down this turn. It sets up Primeape nicely for being caught. Unfortunately, Ursaring does survive and is able to take down Electrode, and it doesn't get paralyzed either. I send out Seal, and then I decide to go ahead and throw an Ultra Ball at Primeape. If I can catch it, that's great. If I can't, well, that's not so good. I finish off Ursaring, and then he sends out the final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Hypno, which is another Pokemon I need to catch. Ninetales goes down. I send out Grimer, but at this point, things are getting a little dire. I really need to get lucky on these ball throws, so I throw another Timer Ball, which luckily does catch the Shadow Primeape, and now all that's left is the Shadow Hypno, which is doing way more damage than I expected, and unfortunately Sludge Bomb didn't do as much as I was hoping, and didn't poison. And so it's all up to Seal. I decide to go for Rest here. I get 2 more attempts at ball throws. The first one gets very close, but unfortunately does not catch. Shadow Storm takes me all the way down to 23 because now I have no partner Pokemon, and unfortunately it only shakes 1 time on the following turn. So an unfortunate first loss. So I go back into the battle once again, and the start of this fight really isn't all that difficult. The real difficulty comes in the challenge of actually capturing his final 2 Pokemon, and so I'm going to focus more on that. I did bring out an Arbok, that way I can use Shadow Half, and Ursaring just got a crit taking Primeape down. Okay, well, at this point, I have really 2 options. Either I can restart the fight, or I can continue on, and if I end up catching the Hypno and winning, just calling it good, because there's a very good chance Hypno might be able to take down the rest of my team with Ursaring here helping it. So I think that's what I'll do. I need to remind myself that this is supposed to be a fun run. If I don't end up catching everything, it's not a big deal. I guess I always just get so caught up in the actual challenges because they have hard set rules of what you need to do and what Pokemon you can catch and whatnot. I guess it's easier said than done in hindsight now that I'm doing the recording over the challenge. But definitely in the moment, you know, it always just feels like you messed up whenever you take down a Pokemon or circumstances take down a Pokemon for you. Now, that's not to say I'm just going to start skipping Pokemon all the time now, because the sake of the challenge is to try to catch every single one that I can, but I don't think I need to hold myself to the highest caliber when this is just supposed to be for the fun of it. Man, that was a really long speech describing why I was probably just lazy that night and didn't want to do it. Anyway, I catch the Hypno. And now the Kanto Pokemon are moving on to the final area of the game, and Citydark Isle is no slouch when it comes to more Kanto Pokemon to catch, and I do find it a bit strange that like half of the Gen 1 Pokemon are in the last third of the game, including the Cypher base I was just in. Anyway, with that, on the shores of Citydark Isle, I pick up Golduck, and then I finally evolve my Seal into Dugong, and then soon after, I run into a Dodrio, which I capture right away, and then right after that is a Raticate, which I capture as well, before I go over to my box and I decide to swap Fearow for Dodrio because Dodrio is just kind of better. And then I go into the battle against Lavrina. She leads with a Gardevoir and a Gorbis, and right away I go for Thunderbolt into the Gorbis, taking it down in a single hit, and then she sends out her next Pokemon, which is a Roselia, and I go for Heat Wave, which takes Roselia down to half and deals very little to Gardevoir. Go for a Thunderbolt into Gardevoir, taking it down to almost half, and then Heat Wave is able to finish off the Roselia, and then Grimer levels up and gets the move Acid Armor, which I decide to teach over Screech, and then out comes her next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Farfetch'd, another Gen 1 Pokemon, and that should be pretty easy to catch. I go for Thunderbolt, which is honestly very risky, but luckily it plays out because it survives on just a little bit of HP. Ninetales does go down, but I send out Dodrio, that way it's not getting damaged by Farfetch'd. I go for Thunderbolt to finish off the Gardevoir, and then I go for an Ultra Ball to catch the Farfetch'd, which I do, and then she sends out a final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Altaria. Thunderbolt is enough to finish off the Gardevoir, and then all that's left is that Altaria, which I decide to swap over to Dugong for because it actually has Ice-type damage to take it down quickly, unlike Dodrio, who has just Shadow moves that deal almost nothing. So another Thunderbolt takes it down very low, it gets paralyzed, and Ice Beam finishes it off. So with that, a very easy Lavrina fight. Now moving through the volcano, and I pick up Kangaskhan, another Gen 1 Pokemon, and then soon after I run into Magmar, which I snag right away, and then a Pinsir, which I pick up just the same. And then before I get too far into the volcano, I decide to backtrack to go ahead and purify Dodrio, and since I'm in a Gate Village anyway, I decide to teach Body Slam over Slash over at the Move Tutor, heading back into the volcano once again, and I pick up Rapidash, and then soon after Grimer evolves into Muck, which should hopefully help its damage and survivability. At level 34, Electrode gets the move Rollout, which I teach over Swift, and then I pick up a Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan from the explosive duo of Carbon and Petro, and then I move on, I pick up a Lickitung, and then a Scyther, followed by a Chansey, and then we finally make it to the top of Citydark Isle, where I run into Snaddle once again. He has a Quagsire and a Metang, and right away I go for Drill Peck into the Quagsire, not really doing too much damage. Dodrio gets taken down by half by Ice Punch, and luckily Quagsire does go down to a crit Earthquake. He then sends out Scizor, and because I know Sand Slash is going to be outsped, I decide to go for Body Slam instead of another Earthquake because I don't want to damage one of my other Pokemon, and so I send out Ninetales, which takes an Ice Punch very well. Of course, Body Slam doesn't really do too much to Metang. Flamethrower takes down Scizor very easily, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Solrock. Metang goes for Psychic, dealing not much to Ninetales, and then after Metang goes down, he sends out Castform, which shouldn't be too much of a threat. I go for Body Slam and Heat Wave, which Heat Wave doesn't really do too much to either. Solrock is able to set up Shadow Sky, and Body Slam takes Castform down below half. So I should be able to finish it off with just a Flamethrower, though just to be safe I do double into it with Body Slam as well. Flamethrower does take it down, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, which is another Gen 1 staple, that being Starmie. And so Body Slam hits it, not really doing too much damage, though if it did paralyze that would have been nice. It of course is able to outspeed, though it just decides to go for Shadow Mist instead of Shadow Storm, so I'm actually able to survive another turn, and Solrock surprisingly goes for Shadow Panic. Of course Sandslash hits itself in confusion, but honestly that's not too bad. Fruity Pebbles rain down, Ninetales hangs on with 3 HP. I go for Thunderbolt into the Solrock, taking it down to half. Starmie hits itself in confusion, and another Heat Wave gets a crit, taking Solrock down pretty low, enough to where I think I should be able to take it down with another Thunderbolt. Ninetales goes down, I send out Dugong, and as long as I'm able to hit, which it does, Solrock goes down. I go for Surf. Starmie just goes for another Shadow Mist. I wonder if it's because the Shadow Solrock was out and it just wants to use Shadow Panic, and so that's just guaranteeing it hits. I don't know. But anyway, I throw an Ultra Ball, and it captures it on the first attempt. So with that, a very easy Snaddle fight, and so we move on to Ardos, who leads with a Shadow Swallow and Alakazam, and because my Electrode has 130 base speed, I would think it would outspeed the Swallow, but the Swallow I'm pretty sure has a plus speed nature, making it just a little faster than Electrode, and so it's able to set up Shadow Sky. Ice Beam doesn't really do too much to Kingdra, so I go for Thunderbolt and Ice Beam into it once again. Thunderbolt takes it down to yellow, and Dugong gets taken down by Thunder Punch. I decide to send out Dodrio, expecting Kingdra to go for Hydro Pump, but it actually went for Double Edge instead. And so it's nearly taken down. I go for another Thunderbolt just to finish it off, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Heracross. Now, as long as Alakazam doesn't take down Dodrio, there was a very good chance I could have taken down the Heracross right then. But anyway, I decide to send out Sandslash, that way I can take down the Alakazam, and I go for Thunderbolt into the Heracross. Thunderbolt really doesn't do too much though, and Ice Punch one-shots Sandslash. I send out Ninetales, and Heracross goes for Mega Horn, taking down Electrode. So I send out my final Pokemon, Muck, and unfortunately Muck is probably going to be taken down by a single Psychic, and so it's up to Ninetales. Actually, Muck survives. That is very good to know, though it could be a range. Anyway, he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Electabuzz, and his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Snorlax. Both are Gen 1 Pokemon, and this one might actually take a while. So I go for a Confuse Ray into the Snorlax, hoping that it either will hit itself in confusion or just miss. But because the Electabuzz is out, it's going for Shadow Mist, which guarantees that Shadow Wind hits, and it takes down Muck. Though there is an upside, and that is the fact that every time it does hit, it lowers his health by half. So I'm not in a terrible position here, possibly. Now, since this was the first attempt, I wasn't actually prioritizing capturing them, especially with how battered my team was. I thought maybe a victory would be better than capturing them in this case, but I did end up winning, so I now move on to the second attempt, where, once again, Swallow is still faster. I go for Thunderbolt to take it down right away, though, right after it sets up Shadow Sky. And now that I know that Muck can survive one attack from Alakazam, I can go for Sludge Bomb to take it down a single hit, and then he sends out his Kingdra and Heracross now. And even though it's not the best pairing in the world, I can go for Helping Hand and Thunderbolt to get Kingdra down very low very quickly. Muck does go down, and I think that Heracross is going for Rock Tomb into Electrode, but it actually decides to go for Mega Horn, so I think it actually sees the KO from this range. I go for Thunderbolt, which finishes off Kingdra, and now that I actually have Dodrio in a better position, I can go for Drill Peck, one-shotting Heracross, and that brings out his two final Pokemon once again, and so hopefully I'll be able to capture them both. Now, the nice thing about this pairing being together is that Snorlax is always going to be hitting its Shadow Ends, which means it's always going to constantly be having its HP. So I don't actually really need to focus on Snorlax all that much, and the only reason I'm going for Tri-Attack into it is because it has a chance to either freeze, burn, or paralyze, which would all help in catching it. And so I don't really actually need to focus on the Snorlax all that much. I just need to lower Electabuzz's health, that way it's easier to catch. And then I can just pick up the Snorlax after it's hit a few Shadow Ends. So Dugong goes down, and Snorlax is already down to red health. I send out Sandslash, and now it's time to go ahead and throw my first ball. And I decide to target the Snorlax because Electabuzz is just going to be wasting the turn going for Shadow Mist. Unfortunately, it doesn't end up working on the first attempt, and Snorlax does have the leftovers items, so it is going to constantly be healing off a little bit of the damage it's doing. I send out Ninetales, and this time I actually decide to try to capture Electabuzz. Now, in hindsight, almost certainly catching Snorlax is the right choice, because Electabuzz is just always going to be going for Shadow Mist. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out again, and Sandslash gets taken down. So now it all comes down to, strangely enough, Ninetales once again. Timer Ball is able to capture Snorlax, and all that's left is Electabuzz, who is already down at low health, and I don't think it can one-shot me if it ends up not capturing, but it doesn't matter because I capture it. Very nice. Now moving on to Gorgon, he leads with a Slowking and an Ursaring, and right away the Ursaring is going to go for Protect, so I go for Thunderbolt and Sludge Bomb into the Slowking, taking it down in a single turn. And then he sends out his Aggron. I decide to double into the Ursaring because it just protected last turn, so it can't now. And because Ursaring has Earthquake, it was more likely to use it because I have 2 Pokemon weak to it. And then he sends out Walrein. I decide to go for Sludge Bomb into it, and then Thunderbolt into Aggron, though Aggron does survive with a decent amount of health left. Ice Beam into Electro takes it down pretty low, and Earthquake absolutely finishes it off, though Muck does survive with a decent amount of health left. I decide to send out Dodrio, that way it can't get hit by Earthquake, and since Aggron is likely going to protect this turn, I decide to double into Walrein. I get a lucky crit on Drill Peck, which does take it down in a single hit. I'm not sure if it would have done that otherwise, but anyway, he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Poliwrath, another Gen 1 Pokemon. So I go for Tri-Attack, which doesn't really do much to Aggron, and then Sludge Bomb into the Poliwrath, but unfortunately it's not able to get it off. I send out Sandslash, and Iron Tail nearly takes down Dodrio, go for Tri-Attack into Aggron once again, really just hoping to burn, paralyze, or freeze it, but that doesn't end up happening, and Dodrio gets taken down by a Shadow Storm. I send out Dugong because it's the only Pokemon that's not going to take super effective damage from Earthquake, though it does still take quite a lot from it. Poliwrath does survive with a decent amount of health, which is probably good. I go for a Timer Ball into the Poliwrath, which actually does capture it. Very nice, and then all that's left is that Mr. Mime, which takes down Dugong and takes down Sandslash, and so I'm left with Ninetales once again. Okay, well I go for Flamethrower, which gets a crit, taking it down to half, and at this point I just need to hope that the ball works. Come on, Mr. Mime. Yes! Okay, with that we now move on, and we have our final Pokemon that isn't associated with a boss in the game, which is Dugtrio. Hello, Dugtrio. Now moving on to Eldest, he leads with a Shadow Manectric and Ninjask, and right away I need to get rid of the Manectric, that way it's not able to set up Shadow Sky, but it's actually going for Shadow End because it sees the KO on Dodrio, which on one hand is a little unfortunate because that means Dugong is going to take the hit. On the other hand though, it means that Dugong now has a free switch in to handle the Shadow Salamence. Hopefully it's able to. Shadow Rush takes down Sandslash, luckily, and then I send out Electrode. Ice Beam is not quite enough to take down Salamence, but that's why Electrode is out to finish it off. And then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Flygon. Flygon is much weaker than Salamence is, so it goes down in a single hit. And then out goes his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Marowak, our next Gen 1 Pokemon to catch. Unfortunately, I made one mistake, and that is that Marowak has the Lightning Rod ability, though luckily I'm not punished for it. I go for an Ultra Ball to try to catch it, and then I go for Ice Beam to take down the Ninjask. Unfortunately, Marowak does not get caught on the first one, and luckily it misses another Shadow End. So I decide to go ahead and swap into Ninetales, and then go for another Ultra Ball, hoping that it catches this time, which it does not. Okay, well, Ninetales is now out, and it takes significant damage from Dig from Ninjask. I decide to go for Heat Wave, that way I can deal with the Ninjask and deal a little bit of damage to the Marowak. And Ninjask doesn't go down, and unfortunately it ends up missing Marowak, which is just kind of unfortunate. Anyway, he sends out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Lapras. Marowak finally hits a Shadow End, taking down Dugong, but that's perfectly fine. I swap into Muck, and now Marowak has lowered its health a little bit, so I decide to go ahead and go for a Timer Ball now that the battle's been going on for a while. And it actually does end up picking up the Marowak this time, and all I have to do is catch this Lapras. Sludge Bomb does a decent amount, and it also poisons, which is very nice because that will raise my catch chance on it. And I go for Confuse Ray, and all I need to do now is wait. If it hits itself in confusion, that's great, which it does, and then the poison will take effect, pulling it down a little more. And I just need to be able to catch it within the next turn or two. Unfortunately, the first one does not go so well. It doesn't hit itself in confusion, so it's able to take down Ninetales and deal very little to Muck. I guess it is very especially bulky though. And now the poison takes effect, taking it down to red, another timer ball. And luckily, only on the second ball, it's able to be caught. So now moving on, at level 41, Electrode gets the move Light Screen, which I teach over Mirror Coat, and then I go into the battle against the big box legendary Shadowlugia. And I'm very glad that I don't need to catch Shadowlugia, because I remember this taking forever the last time I had to do it. That wasn't just immediately using a Master Ball. Anyway, going for Thunderbolt and Tri-Attack is actually doing quite a bit of damage to it. Unfortunately, Electrode does get taken down. I send out Ninetales, and luckily Tri-Attack actually does paralyze, so I'm able to outspeed. Flamethrower doesn't deal much damage, but it's enough for Tri-Attack to come in and finish off Lugia. So now moving on to the final battle against Corrigan, and his entire team is made up of Gen 1 Pokemon. So I need to make the decision now. Am I catching any of these, or am I just defeating his team to beat the challenge? And I think for this run, just defeating him should suffice. So with that, I go into the battle. Unfortunately, I wasn't well set up for the start of this because I was more focused on taking out the Shadowlugia. But now that I have Dugong out, I can go for Surf, which does enough to take down the Rhydon from half and deal a little bit of damage to Moltres. Then out comes Executor. I go for a Drill Peck into it, and I decide to go ahead and try to catch Moltres. If anything, that would progress the fight a little further. Doesn't end up working. I send out Muck. Drill Peck does only half to Executor. It hits a Shadow End, taking Muck down very low. And at this point, I decide to go ahead and take down the Moltres with Dodrio. Muck does get taken down by a Shadow Fire. I send out Sandslash. Drill Peck does take down Moltres, and then he sends out his Tauros. Now, unfortunately, it does have Intimidate, and both of my Pokemon are physical attackers. So that's not the greatest thing. I decide to just go ahead and take down Executor at this point, though. Unfortunately, I don't get the chance because Sandslash is slower. So now moving on to the second attempt, and this time I actually have Pokemon arranged in a good order. So I go into the battle, I go for Surf, dealing quite a bit of damage to Rhydon and only a little bit to Moltres, though I was able to set up Light Screen, lessening the amount of damage that Moltres was doing. Luckily, Rhydon did miss on the first Shadow End, and unfortunately, Electrode missed its rollout, but that might have actually worked out in my favor because now I go for Thunderbolt, taking down Moltres, and then he sends out his Tauros once again. I can go for Ice Beam into the Tauros to deal a little bit of damage. Unfortunately, Dugong does go down, but it's already done its most important role right at the beginning. I send out Muck, I go for Thunderbolt and Sludge Bomb, which Thunderbolt doesn't quite finish off Tauros. It sets up Shadow Sky, Sludge Bomb does take it down though, and then out comes his next Pokemon, which is an Articuno. Now unfortunately the Shadow Sky is up, so the damage from Shadow End is going to deal quite a lot. I decide to send out Ninetales, and the Fruity Pebbles are now raining down. I go for Thunderbolt and Heat Wave, which Thunderbolt, with a crit, nearly takes down Articuno in a single hit, and Heat Wave is able to take down Executor, and Articuno actually survives with just a sliver, though I do outspeed with Electrode, so I will be able to take it down. Or maybe I should set up Light Screen again. I decide to set up Light Screen again. Hopefully they decide to just take down Electrode, which they do, and I send out Dodrio. And Heat Wave is able to connect, taking down Articuno and burning Zapdos, which is very nice because now I won't have to deal as much damage because none of my Pokemon are especially effective against it. I send out Sandslash, go for Drill Peck, not really doing too much, but the burn is going to lower it to nearly half. Another Drill Peck and Body Slam. Unfortunately, it gets a crit one-shotting Sandslash. I'm not sure if it would have done that anyway. The Shadow Sky ends, and Dodrio hangs on by 3 HP, just enough for Burnt to finish it off. What a very exciting end to the Kanto run. However, I wasn't satisfied. I thought that I was fine not catching any of his Pokemon, but then I thought, wouldn't it be fun to try to do so? Now, I will say, this is definitely the weirdest part of the entire game. The whole snag system of catching other people's Pokemon, I think throughout a majority of the game, works very well. But actually trying to capture the Pokemon Greevil has, as intended here, is actually incredibly difficult. Like, starting with Lugia, you can capture that just fine. It probably will take a while, but once you capture it, you can purposely lose this fight and then come back to it. But then you're greeted by 3 legendary birds, Executor, Rhydon, and Tauros, which 3 of those aren't probably all that bad, but 3 legendary birds are terrible. Now, I know there's the Mirror Bee system in place that gives you access to all the shadow Pokemon that you ended up missing throughout the journey, but if you really just want to catch them all in one go, it is very difficult, and so you have to create cheese teams, I guess is what I'd call this. A majority of my Pokemon are shadow Pokemon to take less damage from them, and I have moves like Shadow Half and Shadow Panic in order to confuse and lower their health. And I also had Electrode on this team. The whole point was to set up Substitute, and then I'd go for Shadow Half, which would break the Substitute, and then I could go for Light Screen on the following turn, and then just go for Substitute again, which would stall out Shadow Half. That really didn't end up working, but it was the idea I had in mind going into this. Now, the other issue is that Shadow Panic, while it is nice for slowly whittling things down, unfortunately it also means that things can faint if they're confused, and unfortunately that's what happened to Moltres, which is just a bit unfortunate. Anyway, since this is just going on in the background, and it really doesn't matter too much, I guess I'll go ahead and start finishing off the video here. So, if you wanted to know, they beat the game at a time of 14 hours and 36 seconds, with 10 feints throughout the game, 5 of those to bosses and 5 of those to random trainers. And I guess if I did decide to rank it, I would probably put it in the C tier, probably above Butterfree, so about the middle. So it's not incredibly good. A lot of the time wasted is just going out and having to catch Pokemon, and the other time wasted is me not really taking the time too seriously. Like I said, this is a fun run. I didn't really worry too much if I was using Pokemon that weren't the most effective. Like, take for example, Vaporeon. I decided to swap out over to Seal, but Vaporeon already had a level advantage. It could do more, I think, and it probably would have been more effective overall. Same thing with Grimer. Like, Grimer's not a fantastic Pokemon, but I just wanted to use it. So with that, we now have our final box of all the Pokemon in order of when you could obtain them. That's why Sandslash and Zubat are up higher than when I actually got them. Unfortunately, I did miss Paris and Primeape, and then finally Moltres. And of course, I didn't end up getting Dragonite because that is very much post-game, and I would have had to catch every other Shadow Pokemon to get it. And now looking at the box, I almost regret not catching those 3 Pokemon. But anyway, if you did enjoy this video, consider liking and subscribing. If you have any Pokemon suggestions, please put them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and bye!